दिवसीय कार्यक्रम के 7वें दिन के दूसरे सत्र में आप सभी का स्वागत है। और इस सत्र में अलेसांद्रा मैम द रोल ऑफ द ट्रांसलेटर विषय पर अपनी बात रखेंगी। तो हम अलेसांद्रा मैम से अनुरोध करेंगे कि अपनी बात शुरू करें। धन्यवाद।
शुरू करने से पहले मैं ये बताना चाहती हूँ कि मुझे एक ईमेल मिला जो मतलब रिक्वेस्ट था कि मैं अपना पीडीएफ इन स्लाइड को भेज दूँ, लेकिन मैं हर एक को पीडीएफ नहीं मतलब ये नहीं भेज सकती हूँ। पूरे पीडीएफ जो स्लाइड्स के होते हैं पूरे मैं भेज चुकी हूँ। तो मैंने रिक्वेस्ट किया कि आपको भेज दें, तो मैं विश्वास करती हूँ कि ये जल्दी हो जाएगा ना, जल्दी से जल्दी, क्योंकि लोग अच्छा ठीक है ओके। और हर रोज मैं पीडीएफ बनाकर उनको देती हूँ, तो मतलब थोड़ा सा धैर्य have some patience, bear with us, it will come। ठीक है, तो शुरू करें? Okay, so today we are going to talk about the role of the translator, and of course we have a hero. Everybody knows, the first reference we have is Lawrence Venuti. So we are going to start with Lawrence Venuti and his idea of the invisibility, his discussion of the invisibility of the translator and his call to action, because I think he was really like, the starting point for this discussion. But I want to make a step back, because Antoine Berman, he is a little bit earlier than Venuti, and what he describes as negative analytic, I think it's really interesting. So I will just take you also to discuss a little bit of this. We are going to say a few words about translative practice and the translator's positionality. I have repeated very often that you always have to position yourself, because to say, to be aware of who you are and which is your standing point. So, and then we will just have a short view about, the relation between the translator and what we described as the larger circle, the power of publishing. I will only just touch very briefly the sociology of translation, because it has already been dealt with, but I want just to give you a reference that I would like you to be aware of. And I will finish talking about translation, the translator as a resistant fighter. Resistance is something that Venuti talks about, so we are going, as usual, to start with Venuti, discuss Venuti, and then go back to something that is, related to him. So this is what we are going to talk about today, and I am just starting with, Lawrence Venuti se milie, ye Lawrence Venuti hai, and I think everybody knows his name. I mean, at least all the people who are involved in translation, because he wrote these two very important books about, the translator's invisibility and the scandals of translation. His analysis is mostly focused on the situation in North America, in the Anglophone world, and he, of course, starts with a critique of tourist descriptive approach. Do you remember tourist map? The one that I showed you? Was that in the first day, the second day? I don't remember, but, at the beginning, of our talks. So, and he said that, of course, we cannot just stick to this descriptive analysis. We have to include a reflection on social and political aspects. But, of course, this means that, as I'm repeating things, because in Latin they say repetita iuvant, which means that if you repeat, this is very good. It is good for students, you repeat, so you listen over and over, and so you get benefit out of that. So we need to understand the mechanisms that regulate the publishing market, the role of the different actors, and translators are part of the system. So they are not somebody out of that. They are part of the whole system. Do you remember? I showed you this big circle. So translators and translation practices are embedded in, the world, like social institutions. This is something that I have repeated over and over. Also, other speakers have talked about that. It's interesting because he uses the notion of invisibility when he wants to describe the situation of the translators in the contemporary Anglo-American culture. And he says this is because when translators translate into English for an American audience, they need to create this illusion of transparency. And this is not only that kind of invisibility that is there, that is related to translation, but the other invisibility is the one that relates the selection of texts. And we have also mentioned this very often, that the fact that you translate this and not this, or that, your patrons want you to translate this text or these texts and not those texts. This is another form of invisibility for the texts that remain outside. And so what we get is a translated text that, has to be put on the market, and this has to keep, it has to take into account what the majority think is better. What is fluency? Because, what is fluency? What most people, most readers, most publishers think that is, the right kind of fluency, they will promote that. And what is really funny about this whole thing is that in the end, the translated text does not show as a translator. And think of what happened in comparative literature departments for a long time. They were commenting, analyzing world literature in English translation, but they were analyzing stylistically a text as if it were the original. But that was really a translation. So it's funny because the translator has to be erased, but in the end, their production, the text they produce, is the one that is received and, read as if it were the original. So if we make this kind of operation, of course, of process, we are in a sort of wrong circle. It's something that you don't want the translator to be seen because the author has to prevail. But in the end, the text that we are reading, we are analyzing, we are discussing, we are reviewing. Think of the power of reviews, for a text. This is something that challenges the very notion of authorship and the very idea of the original, because what happens is a process of concealing the act of translation, but then in the end of using the translation as an original text. I don't know if this is clear enough, but I think you can see that there is logically something wrong in that. You don't want it to be there because you want the author, but somehow, you get to have exactly the opposite of what we are claiming. So we have very often spoken about two practices that are domestication and foreignization. And we know that, they are the strategies that were described by Schleiermacher, that, the translator doesn't have, the final product has to be, not recognizable as a translation. And of course, as we have already pointed out, that this thing is the product of ethnocentrism. we are talking about English because Venuti was speaking about English, but I mean, this we have seen does not only happen in the USA, in the Anglophone world, in America, it happens also elsewhere. And, we have also pointed out how important this is in the creation of a canon, in the standardization, of literature and literary products and so on. On the opposite side, we have the foreignization that for Venuti, and we will talk about that, he sees foreignization as an act of resistance, because it's something like, that puts the reader in an awkward situation, because the reader is not given a fluent text. The reader is given a text that, makes them stumble. It's like, oh my God, what is happening? And according to Venuti, foreignization is a strategy that, let's say, is desirable because it will stop the ethnocentric attitude in the Anglo-American world. So, yeah, it's like, something that modifies, the text in order to make it visible that, look, this is the translation, and the author is saying something, and the translator is like highlighting something. Okay. It's interesting because this is an example of what he does. The name Venuti, you can see that, maybe you don't know, but it's an Italian name. He knows Italian, so and it's interesting because I put you here for an example, Venuti's translation of an Italian text, and interestingly enough, the translation he chooses, the texts that he chooses to translate from Italian are not the most important ones. They are not the ones that are recognized as the text in the Italian canon. He chooses Ugo Tarchetti, Ugo Tarchetti, who is a very minor Italian writer of the 19th century. He comes from Milan, and you might know or you might not know, but you have to know that Italy has the center in Tuscany. Our standardized language is a standardized form of a language that comes from old Tuscany. So if you come from other, it's like, being from, I don't know, Bihar instead of Benares or Allahabad, your Hindi is different. So this kind of Italian is different. And what does he do? He translates it using American slang. And this is really very strange because, he adheres to the form of the source text, but he modifies it. And, for example, he creates some words. He uses some words in English that are not standard. For example, he creates this expression to induce somebody. That is like to lead somebody to do something. This is not really standard English. And he also mixes, slang, contemporary slang, and archaic forms. Now, he's doing this because he says that, of course, he's trying to make the reader aware of the fact that this is a translation, what is going on. I want you to think about some of these things that I have listed here, and think of what are the problems that very often are highlighted regarding, for example, translation in English by Indians. Because, it's not standard English, it's not the international Hindi. They would use archaic forms, they would use strange forms for the English reader. So you see, in a way, these are strategies that in a different way, they are present also, you know, for example, when you use when you translate into English, and instead of translating into the internationally recognized Hindi, you choose to use a different variant of English. So these are things that I think it's worth taking note of these things, and maybe you'll think about that, because so as I said, I want you to meet another important scholar, and this is Antoine Berman, and he's from France, of course, and he is a source for Venuti. He came earlier, and he created, you know, he wrote about what he describes the negative analytics of translation, because he is analyzing literary texts, and he is interested in all the genre that deform, that you know, play with some metatext. You know, like if you write a pastiche, what is a pastiche? Do you know what is a pastiche? It's a technique, you know, of writing. Anybody knows, has an idea? No? It's when you take many different bits and pieces from many different sources, and you put them to, it's like a collage, you know, you stick them together, you create something totally new, and you do it on purpose. It's not because you cannot write yourself, but it's like you do it very often because you want to write a parody. So you want, you know, people will recognize the original text, but you are making a parody. So it's like, you know, you are like, what is a parody?
Imitation of someone very popular.
Yeah, it's like, it's an imitation, and generally it's ironic or sarcastic. You know, it's something that takes something. This is a strategy that is very much used, for example, in postmodern writing, you know, when there are quotes from famous books or songs or whatever, but they are put in the wrong context, and so they acquire a different tone, a different idea. So Bergman is interested in all these things, and he says, I want to point out what are the kind of deformation of the text, you know, that enter in translation, in order to point out what are the techniques that come into play when we want to hide something, you know. And so his, as I said, he comes before Venuti, because his book comes out in 1984, so it's much earlier than that. And he speaks of translation as a challenge, because la traduction comme l'épreuve de l'étranger. It's a challenge, the challenge of the foreign. When we translate, the foreign meeting the other is our challenge. We have, you know, talked about that when we were talking of cultural encounter. But if you think of also what we said about, you know, the heterolingual level, you know, the other is not necessarily a very far culture. It can be the other that we find, for example, in different variants of our language. So how do we translate them? And of course, then we have, I mean, these ideas were taken up by Venuti, for example, and for Bergman, foreignization is better than domestication, but we will see if this is always true. Okay? So he talks about negative analysis. What does it mean? The definition is that it is mainly concerned with ethnocentric and annexationist translations and hypertextual translations, pastiche, imitations, adaptations, free writing, in which the play of deforming forces is freely exercised. Deforming forces is what we had defined as manipulation earlier. Can you recognize the same kind of pattern? So, the translation I mean, the translator, sorry, is always manipulating the text, and he or she is exposed to deforming and to ethnocentric forces, because the translation has to be sold, has to be circulated, and so the translator is not always free to do what they want. Let's see what these deforming tendencies are. I just wanted you to have the list, because many people want, like I saw that many questions were like, oh, what do I do when it's like this, when it's here you have a nice list of possible things that you might want to do or might not want to do. It depends on what here is your aim, what is your policy, what is your final aim. So we have the rationalization, which is like, for example, I have one whole page without a dot, and the publisher says, oh, this cannot be. I mean, in Italian, nobody. This is a real thing, so you please put some commas, please put some dots, because otherwise, the reader will not be able to read. What do I do as a translator? Do I say, oh, yes, okay, let's do it? Or do I say, no, look, the author has done it for a reason, so I'm not going to make syntactic structure easier for the reader. Clarification, we had an example, during the one of the lectures. We constantly were told that you have to explain things, because otherwise the reader will not understand. But when you clarify too much, sometimes this is necessary, but Umberto Eco always said that if a 100 pages text in translation has 200 pages, then this means that the translation is not good, because it's clarifying too much. The reader, okay, this is what I think. You might disagree with that, but I mean, I think that we should have some trust a little bit in the text, that our readers are intelligent. I mean, let them think. Why do we have to explain everything? Of course, there are some things that maybe in that context are very difficult, but especially in the age of internet, I mean, my reader will be able to Google something if I'm not explaining everything. So I don't know if you agree, but this is another kind. Sometimes, make clear something that is not clear is necessary. Some translators do it too much, overdo it. And then, of course, this means to the third, the expansion of the text, and then, the ennoblement. Like I was giving you the example of an experiment in translating Hindi poetry into English, where the final translation was a sort of ennoblement of the text. It made it suitable to the idea of poetry that is there in the States. On the opposite side is like popularization, when you think that something is too high and then you want to make it to rewrite it, and I told you, sometimes rewriting is okay, sometimes it is not. So then, of course, another thing that comes is that this brings to an impoverishment of the quality of the text, because you choose to stick to the standard text, in the standard language, and put it, the source text as some different words, and in the target text, you standardize it. So this is an impoverishment. And of course, this also brings both to a qualitative impoverishment and a quantitative impoverishment. At the level of form, this creates, of course, the destruction of rhythm. And this is not only true for poetry. Even prose has a rhythm. Even think of, like a writer like Nirmal Verma, with short sentences, a lot of silence, a lot of dots, silence. And then, think instead of, the prose, I don't know, Uday Prakash. He's very rich, and he's like, bringing in. It's not difficult, but it's much, I would say, like, yeah, I mean, it's more, it brings you from one thing to another. Well, Nirmalji is always like, he always brings you from one thing to another, but in a totally different way, And this is done through the rhythm also, If you destroy the rhythm, the final translation is not good. And so, of course, this doesn't allow the reader to understand for example, the network of words. Because sometimes, for example, when I translate from Hindi into Italian, one of my problems is that Hindi is a word that likes repetition, likes this double construction. You say chai vai. How do I translate it into Italian? Because it's tea and something else, it's something, but in Italian, if I only say tea, it's not chai vai. And so I have to use something different. But if I want to keep the rhythm, I will give you an example in the last class. So you destroy also the linguistic patterns, the vernacular networks, or, sometimes the exotization also. Idioms, we have very often spoke about the importance of idiomatic expressions. And these all finally just, erases the trace of the different linguistic forms. Sorry, I left the Italian. It's in the source, in the testo di partenza. So in the source test, I will correct it. So this is the negative. So what do we do if we want to take something positive? So it's like, this is, as you can see, it's not like a list of things that you should never do. It's a list of the things that you might do if you don't think about what you are doing while you are translating and choosing, to use a word, an explanation or something. So the proposal is to create a translation that maintains the foreign element also in the target text. And this maintaining this foreign element is explained as literal translation. Now, don't think that in this context, literal translation means word to word. It's not like that. What he thinks about, the notion of literal translation is like literal because it is attached to the letter of the words. So it's like you are very aware of the etymological aspect of the word, of the words, of the meaning that it has in the source culture, and in the source text, in the source literature. And then your translation must be literal, which doesn't mean that you have to use this exactly, like the equivalence word to word. Maybe Naida was thinking of that, like, the dynamic equivalence. You should look for something that, is respectful of the letter of the work. And of course, this means that you can change a lot. As long as you are doing this with reference to this signification process. You are choosing your final way with different strategies because you are trying to be sensitive to the source text. And you are literal in this text. Any question? Is it clear? Anybody has a problem with this idea? Is it clear enough? Okay. So we can make a step, another step, and we can try to see what happens when we in this, I mean, as a translator, we are, you know, trying to, he was saying that it's a challenge. You see, it is a challenge. Look at how many things we have to think, you know, about and to be aware of. So Venuti says that, of course, our positionality must be seen. It means that we don't have to be invisible, we have to be seen, and our choices, our final choices, the text that we produce, will be a reaction to the common idea of translation. We have to be, it's a call to action, because he says you should refuse to translate when they say that you have to insert commas in you remember the page with no punctuation. And when your editors are so good, they always know what you're supposed to do. You know, editors are always writing in the right way. You know, you give something and they make it better. But sometimes they don't know, because they don't know the original text. And so if the publisher, if the editor tells me, okay, you have to add dots, what could I do? For Venuti, I should just say, I'm not doing this job. I'm opting out. Sorry, let somebody else do it. And this is very good, you know, because, I mean, it's a very strong positioning, you know. It's like something that if you have an idea and you are proud of your ideas, you should do it. Good. Now, it would be interesting to see what translators have written about their work, because this could give us an idea of how they have negotiated all these kind of problems. Because I don't know, I mean, if you have if you sign a contract and then you say, okay, I'm not respecting the contract, you might have to pay some fees, you know, because there is a penalty, or maybe you need to work because you have a family and this is your job, you know. This is something that, unless you're very rich and you can do whatever you want, but normal people generally, they do something because they need, you know, to earn some money. So it's easy to say, okay, I'm not doing it, but okay, there are different kinds of negotiation. And so here are some examples of names of translators that have written detailed account of their work. I'm not going to discuss it, but if any of you, I don't know, because, you know, you're coming from different areas of studies and maybe you might be interested in, you know, knowing more about this, I think you can go and see, for example, and you can see it's mostly people who translate from Spanish, interestingly enough. So where do translators speak out? You know, we said, okay, you can have these different strategies and so on. Sorry, before that, I wanted to give, well, it's in the paratext anyway. It's of course in the paratext, you know, in the introduction, afterwards, notes, if you can make notes, you know, in this kind of things. But, for example, Suzanne Gilles Levine, I don't know how to pronounce it, she wrote a very interesting book about the subversive scribe. So, and she says that she is a translator and collaborator, because she doesn't see her act of translation as something that, you know, puts her like in antithesis to the author. She is collaborating with the author. So this is the idea, you know, when I am translating, I am a collaborative author, and my choices, of course, are subversive. I will give you an example. There is a famous song, it's Guantanamera, anybody knows it? Yo soy un hombre sincero, de dove viene la palma. And this means I am a sincere, a very good man, coming from the place where palm trees grow. And she translates this, yo soy un hombre sincero, as I am a man without a zero. She's not faithful. She's not being faithful. She's translating something. So apparently she is domesticating. Isn't this? I mean, she's not giving the original text, but the way she's translating it, it is foreignizing. It's a foreignizing domestication. Can you believe that something like that can be done? Here you have an example. So I think these are the very subtle strategies that we can use, because like this is a problem that when you translate, for example, into Italian or English, some Hindi words, we were talking about Uday Prakash, okay? In Piri Chatrivalarki, you have songs, not only, I mean, I'm just taking one of the many examples that you can take, you know, Hindi popular songs, filmy songs. I mean, here, if I translate it to English for Indians, I don't have to translate them. Everybody knows the songs. But if I translate it for Italians, nobody knows these films. So I have to, what do I do? Do I translate these songs into standard Italian? Do I leave the original text, but then nobody will understand anything? And so what do I do? Well, I don't know. It depends. I will choose. But what she does here, she chooses to domesticate it. She doesn't leave the Spanish text, but she does it foreignizing, because the final, the linguistic result, it has a rhythm, because I am a man without a zero. If you sing it on the tune, you know, like yo soy un hombre sincero, you see that I am a man without a zero. You can sing it over, you know, but it's very strange. So it will just, you know, make you stop and think. What is this about, you know? So this is, of course, something, what she describes as being a subversive scribe. And so as a translator, you can be resistant. Your resistance can be like, okay, I'm not working if they don't let me do whatever I want. Or you can choose different kind of strategies. And Maria Timochko, for example, is another translator who was very crucial in exploring the connections between translation and creative writing. And this is something that we have already seen, that it's very complicated, because how far can we go in being creative when we translate? Is there a limit? Translating, we said, is crossing borders. But, I mean, can we cross any border? Can we? So, and she is really like, you know, trying to consider all these things, considering the position of the translator, she says, in the in-between, in the liminality, you know, in the in-between position between, you know, the author, the final translation, and the translator is not, of course, a neutral mediator. The translator is not somebody who works in isolation. The translation is always inserted into a network. Do you remember the idea of the polysystem? So when you are a translator, you are always intervening in the text. And so the translator is an intervenient being. I mean, we don't have to think of translation as something neutral. Neutrality is something that is always something that we create, because it's very, I mean, it makes us very comfortable, and, you know, but we have to be aware of the complications of this. So Carol Meyer, as I said, she's another translator, and she is important because she considers the translator as an ethical agent of social change. Now, yesterday I was talking about somebody else who had more or less the same idea. Can you remember? You know, an ethical agent of social change. When you translate, you are changing society. Gramsci had this idea that, you know, the translator, any translation brings about a change. So you see, these are, because I'm sure that, you know, ideas come up in very different contexts, and it's very nice to see, you know, these networks of ideas, you know. So, and she's also working on South American authors. So we have, you know, described the translator as somebody who is not isolated, which doesn't mean that you have to have the collective translation. I like a lot to translate with other people, you know, to sit and discuss. And, you know, I translated the last poem by Kumar Narayan, which is Kumarjiv. You know who was Kumarjiv? He's considered one of the greatest translators in the world, you know, and he's the one who brought Buddhism into China, translating into Chinese Sanskrit texts that then many of them were lost. So we have the Chinese texts, and where we have both, we can see that it's really a good translation. It was considered a good translation. Actually, Kumarjiv was there, but this was like a translating academy. You know, it was like a very collective action. So I think it was something, in a sense, very modern, you know, something that we would do nowadays. I like this kind of idea, but saying that we are not isolated doesn't mean that we necessarily have to work with others, like, you know, translate with another person. The fact that you are not isolated is the fact that you are inserted in the whole system, the poly system, you know. So, and what is your network, which is, of course, a network that implies power as well. It's publishers, copy editors, and the literary agents of the author. You know, all these people will like tell you, well, why don't you insert commas? So Venuti, I mean, he in his writings, he was really lamenting the fact that in our contemporary world, translators are not paid enough. They very often have like time pressure because the publisher wants the book to be ready when the book fair will be, you know. Okay, the book fair is in September, so you have to give me everything in July. And so you have to translate 1,000 pages in 3 months, which is like, and then of course you can say, no, I'm not going to do it. Some people might say, well, okay, I'll try to do it. So there is this big pressure by the publishing industry, and this is, of course, what makes the publishing network, it has been defined as a power game. Because sometimes the intervention of editors, copy editors, and publishers, I mean, is very strong. I will talk about, you know, what happened with my translation, and more. I did it with my colleague of mine, but I'm talking, you know, of Red Samadhi, for example. I was not really free because, you know, I insisted on some things, but on some others, you know, for example, in the original text, the different chapters don't have any number, but the American translation has numbers. And I think this is because American people, sorry, I don't know, just shut up, but they are stupid because they cannot understand that if you have a new thing, it's a new chapter, do you need to have a number? If the author doesn't put numbers, why do you have to put numbers? Well, anyway, American readers cannot do it. And at the same, so because the English version had numbers, then even the Italian publisher and also the editors, they said, no, we have to have numbers. So I discussed I discussed on many things, and then, you know, on this particular thing, I said, okay, it's not so relevant. Let's put numbers, even if I did not agree. But, you know, this is how, you know, you always have to negotiate. And for example, there is, I mentioned what happened, for example, when Milan Kundera, that you might know, he's a very famous writer, when he got one of his works translated as The Joke, and then he found out that actually the published text was the translation of his text, but it was not even recognized as the author's text. So there was, you know, he sued the translator, and there was all. I mean, you have different kind of situations, and you can see that, of course, the author, because we always say the translator has less power than the original author, but sometimes even the author has less power than the publisher and, you know, the publishing market and all these things. Because, for example, you know, maybe the publisher will say, okay, I will put this cover, and maybe the author doesn't like it very much, but he or she will say, okay, if they say that it's better for the market, so sometimes, you know, you have to negotiate. So all this thing makes the situation such that the benchmark for the authors is to be translated into English, you know. But for Venuti, this means he says that the choice of the texts that have to be put into English is done by the publishers, and he says that the texts that are chosen are only, you know, the ones that are very easy to be read. But nevertheless, you know, we have to consider also numbers, because, you know, maybe, okay, they choose something, and the circulation is such that, you know, maybe some texts are excluded. But, you know, if we look, there is another way of looking at all this network, which is like, you know, from afar. If you study world literature, you might know that there is a trend of studies that sees literature from afar, like you see it quantitatively and not qualitatively, you know. So of course, maybe the percentage of translation in the English world is lower, but because it's a huge market, then we can see that somehow, you know, we can compare. Numbers always have to be interpreted. If I only give numbers, it may mean different things. So, Venuti, of course, is our hero today, because he was, you know, but, you know, Anthony Pym, he was very critical of Venuti, and he raised a lot of questions, and I listed here 3 questions that I think are really interesting, because he says, okay, the call to action, this is very good. It's good if we think of Venuti himself. He's a translator, he's a theorist, he's, you know, well established, but can also translators survive if we ask them to do the same thing? Because, you know, this is again where power comes into play, you know, because you are a theorist, so maybe you are in the academic world, you are well paid and so on, but this is good. I think the call into action is something that I think all of us agree with that. But is it really something that we think that can, if all the translators refuse to translate what they don't like, will we really improve translation? Or will we only have, for example, a lot of unemployed translators, and then, you know, somehow the market will go on? So this is what Pym raises. And then he's also critical about the notion that domestication is something that is typical of the English world, but he points out that this happens also, for example, in Spain, France, and other languages, and I would also say that it's something that happens also in India. And then he says, okay, Venuti created this theory, but if you have a theory, you know, you should have a test, you know, that proves that this works. So the notion of resistance, can we test it? Can we really, is it testable? So these are the questions that he raises. I don't have an answer, but I think because he's trying to be critical. Of course, he had a lot of discussions and, but I think these three things are very important. And it's true because Venuti doesn't offer a specific methodology, but I think what he's saying can be really these theoretically concepts are useful because we can use them, in order to compare, for example, source text and target text regarding, it's alienation, I wrote it, okay, it's foreignization, sorry, I have to correct it. So the two things, how they are used, are they always used in the wrong way, or, for example, as I showed you in that example, they might be used in a very creative way. And then, you can use it to analyze texts with respect of the strategies that have been used by the different translators. We can, for example, analyze contracts, the contract that a translator signs, how they are written, what they require. This is also something that has not been done very much. It's something that, I don't know about India, but for example, in Italy, there is a national association for translators. So they have contracts that are recognized. The publisher are generally trying to give you something that is, maybe different. So you have to insist, no, look, I want the regular contract. So this part of the work of the translator is something that we don't discuss very much, but I think it's something that in translation studies should be taken into account. And of course, we could also analyze reviews, because when you have the review of a translated text, generally the review is written as if this were the original text. So an analysis of this, I don't know if it has been done very much, but it's something, in some areas it's, been done. But one scholar that did this is Meg Brown, because she was really interested in the reception, the review of translation, which is a part of our work as translators that generally is not, okay, you give the translation and then you're done. But then, if your translation gets good reviews, this has an effect. And so she, for example, is very critical about reviewers. And I don't know how it is here, but now there is this general idea that peer reviews are the best things, and so on and so forth. I'm sort of critical about this. It's somehow like in Italy, in Hindi, we are very few people. So you have the double blind peer review, but, because in our field, if I read something, I know who wrote it, because it's a very small field. So it's this peer review, sometimes in certain fields, it's more a tamasha, than something serious. But now we also have to have reviews. But do really the reviewer know what they are doing? For example, if you are reviewing a translation, is the reviewer really able to read the original text, the source text? When they compare, for example, translations, are they really able to read, like, the French translation, the German translation, the English translation? Are they really able to read, first of all, the source text, and then the different languages? This is an issue. It's a very important issue, and I think, that these translation practices, they are not considered part of the translation practices, but it's a big part of what the translator does. And so for Meg Brown, the reviewers were immature people, because she said if you analyze what they write when they review, most of them are not aware that what they are reviewing is a translation, and they don't even raise the question. They might like praise, oh look, Gabriel Garcia Marquez style, it's so nice, and they are reading the English translation of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I know that, for example, the English translation of 100 Years of Solitude breaks one long sentence into two sentences. Okay, also such a nice style. Okay, let's talk about that, because it's a different style. It's not Gabriel Garcia Marquez, it's somebody else, So, of course, as I was mentioning earlier, this is very important, because part of our work, of the role of the translator is also to produce the paratext. And so, writing, for example, the introduction and so on, but also, choosing the right title. The English translation of Red Samadhi is something that I really abhor. Tomb of Sun. I insisted that, this is not the title that I want for my Italian translation, and me and Veronica, because we were doing it together. But so, I mean, the peritext, the title and all these things, subtitles, for example, Joshiji was talking about, subtitles and introduction, the cover, if you can, they will generally say this is not the role of the translation. Well, I don't agree. And of course, in my sometimes I was very free, and I could choose the cover, discuss with the publishers. Sometimes they said, no, this is the cover. And then, of course, I didn't resist so much, okay, because somehow I had a contract and I cannot say, okay, I'm opting out, So, okay, I will only have one slide regarding sociology of translation, because we have already, have a lot of discussion about that. I just wanted to introduce you to Daniele Simeoni, because we have, okay, I'm just, just maybe you remember that Pierre Bourdieu was mentioned as, the one who brought into light the notion of the field, which is, the site of a power struggle between all the participants. These ideas have been, adapted, included into translation studies. And Daniele Simeoni, he was both a translator and a theoretician of translation. So he wrote about the pivotal status of the translator's habitus. Habitus is another important notion that Bourdieu has created, which is like the identity, the social identity, cognitive disposition of all the agents that are participating into a field. And it's like, what makes you belong into, for example, a social group, or like, the field of translator. It means that you are recognized as part of this big circle. And he says that the habitus of the translator is voluntary servitude. This has been criticized, but I wanted to pointing out to you how in translation studies this also has come out, how translators somehow have developed this habitus. So they have been trained and they themselves have acquired, some dispositions, some cognitive dispositions that make them being voluntarily prone and being very willing to accept what is imposed by the persons who have power. Some people said this is not true, but I would like you to think about that, because sometimes we have this sort of, like saying, okay, I think being humble is good, but when being humble means that you don't speak out, then, and sometimes you don't speak out because you even don't think that you could speak out, so, okay. And I'm going to finish with a few words about the role of translator as resistant fighter. So not only as, within the publishing world, but, like translator as fight. And of course, this, when we think of resistance, we mean that we translate and we are like asking to ourselves, why do I translate? What do I translate? For whom? And how? These are the questions, the answers. We have been given many, many answers by many, many people, but, these are the basic things. And for example, I spoke about the choices of Premchand, the choices of Gramsci. Here is another important example when Boris Pasternak, he chose not to write, but to translate. Because Stalin, at that time, he wanted fiction and, creative writing to be in a certain way. And so he said, okay, I'm not writing, I am translating. But his translations, if you see, they are very much, as a resistance, as a fight. And of course, the choice of translating marginalized literature, marginalized texts, this is an example of, this act of resistance. And I'm just, giving you a few examples. You probably know better than I do, but I mean, it's just to finish, to complete this thing. When, for example, we translate women's writing, Dalit literature, Adivasi literature, these are all examples of, choosing texts that have not been part of the canon for a long time. I see a lot of typos, so I will just correct them before sending you the PDF. So, women writing. And now, of course, it's something that, everybody knows it's there, nobody discusses that it should be there or not. But I remember when these texts came out, women writing in India from 600 before Common Era to the 20th century. And this was like an anthology of texts written by women in India from many languages, and they were all translated into English. So it was hailed as a very important thing. Now, if we, and of course, I remember for us it was something, wow, it's great, but we should not forget that it was a very important project to translate from regional languages into English, to make visible, to make audible, these texts. But we can see that, the choices that were made, somehow, somebody has written about that. If you want the correct reference, I will find it out. I can't remember it now. But, it could also be criticized as a strategy to, let's say, cater to the powerful culture, to the Western culture, to the hegemonic language. And the choices that were made, somebody has pointed out that maybe some texts were excluded. Now, of course, it's when you make an anthology, you have to select. So it's impossible to make everybody happy about your choices. But, this was really something very important at that time, And they chose to translate, to give a new translation of texts that were already there in English, because they wanted the translation to be not domesticated, to maintain the foreignizing flavor, and to somehow recreate the historical context. So you see, they made some choices, and so we can criticize them because somehow, you know, it's like, okay, but this is a Savarna choice of Savarna text or whatever, because, you know, this kind of criticism can always be done, but it was important to try to select texts and give a translation having a certain strategy and a certain aim. So you see for whom we are, and this was like a subversive act because it was resisting the mainstream literary approach regarding what was called like Indian literature, you know, something like that. We can also see how important are the translations of texts from Dalit literature or, you know, the Ambedkarism movement from Indian languages into English. Here again, we are translating into the power, the language of power, but, you know, the fact that, for example, some texts, like I'm only just putting two examples, you know, they get translated into English, and then they got a prize. So we have discussed if getting an award is something good or bad. As usual, it depends. In this case, this was a very important recognition of texts that otherwise would not have been even considered. But because they were translated into English, then they become visible. And so even, you know, the Marathi text, the Tamil text, they start circulating and being translated into other Indian languages. So you see, this is another way of, you know, promoting recognition. There is a publishing house like Navayana that is very important. They only publish in English. So Navayana is like, you know, the new vehicle. So of course it's inspired by the Ambedkar ideology, and they translate, they promote translation. They also publish academic books. But I mean, what is important in this choice is that, again, they are translating into English, but they select texts that are not like mainstream texts. And so this is another way of using translation as, you know, to fight, for example, in this case, the hegemonic publishers' power. You know, this can be seen like that. And finally, I'm just giving you the example of what happened with two autobiography of what is called underdog autobiography in English, you know. So an underdog, you know, is somebody who is not present, they are not important, it's somebody who has no chance of, you know, being seen and so on. But it was, yeah, in 2006, so it's almost 20 years ago. You know? This book was published in English by Zuban, which is a feminist publishing house. And it's interesting because this was the English translation of a text that had been published in Hindi, but the original was in Bengali. And it was written, or initially probably written, and, you know, just rewritten by a woman who is a maid. I mean, at that time she was a maid in a household in Delhi. And what happened? That the Bengali original came out only after the Hindi translation came out. So, of course, the English translation brought Baby Halder to the international world. But even before that, we can see that something analogous was happening, because the book that was in Bengali had not been published in Bengali. The publication in Bengali comes when the Hindi which is, I think, Hindi is like, maybe being the official language and so on and so forth. It has a different status. So, they had to see it. They hadn't even seen it, and the publishers were not ready to publish it. But once it is there in translation, they say, oh, okay, come on. So we have to publish it because the Hindi version was so successful. So you see, this kind of translation is a way of, resisting the market even. And this is my last slide, is the last example, is the autobiography, the memoir of a sex worker. Here again, we are, in a very difficult field because the publishers were not ready to publish something that comes from a writer that belongs, to groups, to people that are considered not literate enough. They don't have a high literary style. And these are the problems that we always see, like also for the starting generation of Dalit writers, they were said, okay, they are not. But the fact that you say it's not literary enough, it's because you have a standard. So the translation in this case resisted this notion, and so it was translated in English, and then it got a huge recognition, and then also the original began to be read and disseminated. So I will just stop here, and so we can have some time for questions. And so as you see, the role of the translator is not only to be a communicator, not only we have repeated this very, very, very often, but the role of the translator is also to be an active agent in the field of translation, in the publishing field, in the whole big circle that we have seen in one of the slides that I showed before. So you have some references here, and I will send it to you. I'll have it sent to you very soon. Thank you. So
आप लोग कोई सवाल हो तो आप लोग पूछ सकते हैं.
There is a strong trend of domestication in the translations by Bhartendu Harishchandra, Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi, Ramchandra Shukla, and Premchand. So, where translation is, utilized as an ideological tool. So, like, where should we draw the line? Like.
I don't think there is one line that could be valid for everybody, because when I was discussing Premchand, I think I gave some examples of how he is domesticated, because he's even changing the names. But why is he doing it? You say because he has an ideological, okay, but this was very subversive. So he is using domestication in order to reach some other goal. So, of course, you say, when should we stop? I don't know. It depends on the text. It depends on, for example, when should Premchand stop? He would have stopped when he would have thought that, okay, this is not useful for me, But when he thought, okay, if I put the name, I put Pap Mochan, that it's like, it comes, like, it reminds you of Sankat Mochan, and it's, this will, like, help the readers, to connect to the text. And so, and I also pointed out that you can think that this is a form of creating an exoticism, but he was doing it for Indian readers in a certain area, Hindi readers, who were in the process of, as you said, like making their identity recognized. So in this case, this strategy is justified by these factors. Of course, if I do it in a different context for different purposes, maybe I could criticize it as something that is not correct. Like we might think, okay, when this happened in the English context, made by colonizers because they were trying to project let's say the local culture as inferior, then this is ethnocentrism. Or what do you want to think of ethnocentrism also in what Premchand was doing? I don't know, we can discuss it, because yes, somehow he was like ethnocentric in the sense that he was trying to project Indian culture as superior to the English one. But this kind of ethnocentrism, like a counter ethnocentrism, I don't know, was because it came out of the colonial experience. So it's very complicated. And maybe, for other kind of texts, we have other kind of problems. So I don't think I cannot say, okay, when you reach this point, you have to stop. You have to decide it according to the text that you are translating, the author that you are translating, the historical context where this text comes from, the culture and all these things, and then you choose. That's why I think it's correct to think of translation as a challenge, because it's always a challenge, for us. It's in the end, it's always like a problem of making choices, and this is, it's hard work. But, so I'm sorry, I don't have a recipe that is valid for all the translations. And as I tried to show you, domestication is very often considered something wrong, but sometimes it's useful. So.
ट्रांसलेटर जब हम कोई कॉन्ट्रैक्ट साइन करते हैं तो ऐसी कौन कौन सी चीज़ें हैं जो हमको ध्यान रखनी चाहिए कि हमको जब कॉन्ट्रैक्ट साइन कर रहे हैं कि ट्रांसलेशन के लिए, तो उसमें किन किन चीज़ों को हमें ध्यान रखना चाहिए?
मैंने जो 12 पॉइंट्स दिखा दिया, तो वे कहाँ हो? और लीगल, और you think? Oh, I will talk about that when we talk about the ethics of translation, because yes, we have always to be careful about what is the contract we are signing. But now I think, for example, that being I don't know how it is in India. Can you help me? Because I don't know exactly what is the situation. Is there like an association or many associations for translators that they have, like I will talk about this situation in Italy and in other countries, because like to be a recognized translation, for example, in Italy, you have to be part of these associations. And this means that if you are part of this association, you are accepting some rules, but you have also some, because I mean, you are part, you're not alone. And so even when you go to you are dealing, we are mostly talking about literary translation, but think of translation as something that can be used also, for example, as interpreting. You are working in a hospital as an interpreter. In Italy, it's very often something that we do in courts, because, there is like a court case, and then, maybe there is the necessity of somebody who knows the language. And so you are required to do what is a legal translation, something that is legally approved. And in order to do it, you have to be part of a recognized association. Otherwise, it's not enough that oh, I am a Hindi wala, I can do it. No. So, yeah. Sorry? हाँ जी, और मैं सोचती हूँ कि यहाँ भी कोई ना कोई एसोसिएशन होगा, कोई ना कोई, पता नहीं कैसा होता है अब, हाँ, अनुवादक के लिए
नहीं, ऐसा एसोसिएशन तो सब चीज का है, वो तो है ही। अनुवादकों की अपनी सोसाइटी बनी हुई है और सब लोग उससे अटैच्ड जरूर हैं, मगर उनके इंटेलेक्चुअल प्रॉपर्टी में जो उनका अधिकार है, ये जो कॉपीराइट एक्ट के अंतर्गत, इसमें कोई बहुत सारी व्यवस्था कोई एकदम मैनेज्ड स्थिति में यहाँ है नहीं। मैंने ही एक किताब का अनुवाद किया है इंडिया एंशिएंट पास्ट का, जो ऑक्सफोर्ड यूनिवर्सिटी से प्रेस से छपा है। तो उसने तो पहले मुझे ऑफर किया था ये लमसम, मैंने कहा नहीं, आप परसेंटेज पर बात कीजिए। बाकी जो कुछ संस्थाएं हैं जो सरकारी प्रकाशन है, जैसे नेशनल बुक ट्रस्ट, जैसे पब्लिकेशन डिवीजन, ये सब गवर्नमेंट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है। तो इन सब ने भी अब वो लमसम पेमेंट करना शुरू कर दिया है। यूजुअल केस में यहाँ बहुत रॉयल्टी बेस्ड ट्रांसलेशन का पेमेंट है नहीं। नेशनल बुक ट्रस्ट भी 500 रुपीज़ पर 1000 वर्ड्स उसका ट्रांसलेशन फी दे देता है। पब्लिकेशन डिवीजन यही करता है, और इन सारी चीज़ों के जिम्मेदार तो अल्टीमेटली ट्रांसलेटर खुद ही हैं। एक नहीं, मैं तैयार नहीं होऊंगा, ये तैयार हो जाएंगे। तो ये जो बार्गेनिंग पोजीशन यहाँ है, जो मैंने तब कहा और कहता आ रहा हूँ, पीछे की जितने ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में मैंने काम किया, हर जगह यही बात सामने रखी। नेशनल बुक ट्रस्ट में भी रखा था। मैंने जब वहाँ ज्वाइन किया था तो वहाँ 80 रुपीज़ पर 1000 वर्ड था 93 में। उसको बढ़ा 80 रुपीज़ पर 1000 वर्ड। ये इसको जब से मैं गया 93 में, तब से लेकर 2008 तक रहा। वहाँ लड़ते लड़ते हर बार ये सब करता था, और फाइनली 2008 में मैं वहाँ से जब छोड़कर चला तो 300 पर 1000 वर्ड तक वहाँ पहुँचाया। इसमें सबसे जो मुझे परेशानी झेलनी पड़ती थी कि इसके डिफरेंट स्टेजेस थे। इस कमिटी में पास कराइए, पहले आप कुछ लोगों को बुलाइए, क्यों आप बढ़ाने के लिए इतनी जिद कर रहे हैं, तो कुछ जो इंटेलेक्चुअल्स हैं उनको बुलाया। अब वे उन लोगों के लॉजिक, अरे बहुत मिल जाते हैं ट्रांसलेटर। ये जो चाटुकारिता की जो एक जबरदस्ती प्रेजिंग और जबरदस्ती उसके सत्ता के निकट जाने का, तो इसके कारण मुझे हर समय जो मेरा जो प्रपोजल होता था उससे नीचे आना पड़ता था। अब सबका ये था कि ये क्यों इंटरेस्टेड है, आप इतना इंटरेस्ट क्यों ले रहे हैं, जब ट्रांसलेटर इस मूल्य पर मिल रहे हैं तो आपके इंटरेस्ट की वजह क्या है। यही इग्नू में भी जब था, वहाँ भी ये जब कहता था, वहाँ ज़्यादा यहाँ तो सभी लैंग्वेज का होता था। दूसरा है कि यहाँ जो ट्रांसलेटर्स हैं, जो मैं जो कहा कि ट्रांसलेशन को हमने धंधा बना लिया, ये मैंने कोई मजाक नहीं किया मैडम, ये मेरी पीड़ा है। जो 16 बरस वहाँ काम किया, ये यहाँ पर लैंग्वेज सोवनिज्म इतना है कि तमिल से यदि हिंदी में ट्रांसलेशन होना है तो ये कोई हिंदी पट्टी के लोग, हिंदी स्पोकन पीपल नहीं करता है। वो कोई तमिलियन है जिसने किसी तरह से हिंदी सीखी है, और जिसका मैं वहाँ उपयोग करता था कि उनके द्वारा उस कच्ची हिंदी में जो स्क्रिप्ट आते थे, उसको मैं हिंदी का स्क्रिप्ट बनाने में, मुझे तमिल नहीं आती, जोड़ तोड़ कर असमिया और बांग्ला ये दोनों पढ़ लेता हूँ, बाकी तमिल से कोई ट्रांसलेशन हुआ है उसको मैं एडिट करूंगा तो कैसा करूंगा? तो मैं तरीका ये अपनाता था कि उसको मैं एडिट करता था हिंदी को, और वो पढ़कर फिर से उस ट्रांसलेटर को भेजता था कि भाई मैंने जो एडिटिंग की है आप देख लीजिए, आपको पसंद है या नहीं। आज तक किसी ट्रांसलेटर ने नहीं कहा कि आपने गलत किया है, ऐसा भी नहीं है। मैं इतना भी बड़ा पंडित नहीं था कि मैंने कोई गलत नहीं किया होगा, पर उनको दिक्कत क्या है कि मैं यदि कहूँगा कि आपने गलत किया है तो ये तो वहाँ का एडिटर है, ये गुस्सा हो जाएगा, तो मेरा ट्रांसलेशन नहीं छपेगा। और इसके साथ साथ कोई भी ट्रांसलेटर मुझे 16 बरस में एनबीटी में नहीं मिला, शायद आज भी नहीं होगा, जो कन्नड़ से सीधे असमिया में अनुवाद करे, तमिल से सीधे पंजाबी में अनुवाद करे, ऐसा कोई नहीं है।
लेकिन ऐसा
होना चाहिए एग्जैक्टली। तो आप केवल कीर्तन करते रहेंगे, डफली बजाएंगे कि हम ये अनेकता में एकता हमारे यहाँ है, बहुसंस्कृतिवाद है हमारे यहाँ, उसमें ये सब से काम चलता नहीं है, ये सब केवल कागज की चीज है।
तो मैं ये सोचती हूँ कि अभी चूंकि यहाँ ट्रांसलेशन स्टडीज है यूनिवर्सिटी में, तो स्टूडेंट्स भी है, टीचर्स भी है, मतलब इस translation, there are many people who are involved in translation studies. So if this part of the work of the translator comes into the syllabus, that you know how you teach people to become translators in a professional way, because I know there are many translators, but maybe they are like the one who was living, you know, who translated the poor Chacha, who would live instead of living under a banyan, he would live under a banana tree. And, you know, you have plenty of translators like that. But if you want to have, so what is the value of a translator? Like, you know, why should somebody take translation studies? Why do you want to study this? Because some people think, oh, this is bullshit, you know, it's like blah, 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 blah. Okay, if I study translation studies, and I am also trained in becoming a prof, not only, you know, like making buck, but, you know, becoming a professional translator. So we have like a recognized association. We guarantee a certain kind of quality, you know. This, I think, would be very useful for the people who want to become translators, even if I don't think this means that everybody will get a lot of money, because we have this association and we're still paid very, very little. But anyway, I mean, at least you try, you know, you establish something. And, you know, it's not that I am not against theory. Theory is very important. But if the academic world sticks only to theory, then unfortunately, you know, the world is somewhere else. So we have to be aware that being a translator is both having this, you know, theory, knowing all these things, and kneading bread, you know, you are doing it. And your hands get dirty. I mean, you cannot be like, oh, yes, blah, 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 blah. I have to do it, you know. So I think it's so important. And so if, for example, I don't know, it's just an idea. I'm just speaking freely. I don't know how to do it. But maybe, you know, taking into the syllabus all these things, you know, it's important. So...